Good evening and welcome to Capital Connection, where we join the dots to give you the big picture in Africa. I'm Arnold Segawa. On the agenda, Zimbabweans went to the polls today. For the first time in 38 years, Zimbabwe's 94-year-old founding president, Robert Mugabe, was not on the ballot. It's been called the post-Mugabe era, a new dawn, a new beginning, and a watershed election. Whoever is elected president, rest assured, Zimbabweans will wake up tomorrow morning to the same hardships they suffered from the decade-long stagnant economy. Our panel of experts will discuss the economic challenges and possible strategies that lie ahead for Zimbabwe's recovery. But first, we speak to Derek Matisak, a senior researcher with the think tank at the Institute for Security Studies from the Zimbabwe capital, Harare. Derek, many thanks for making time to speak to us. Just give us a sense of whether or not this is bound to be a free and fair election.
Well, it does very well as far as the free aspect is concerned. It doesn't do very well as far as the fair aspect is concerned. President Mnangagwa has certainly done a lot to open up democratic space as far as the basics of elections are concerned. The political parties have been able to campaign fairly freely. The main opposition parties have been able to campaign in the rural areas, which was always difficult under the Mugabe government. But the electoral playing field remains heavily tilted in favor of the incumbent party, precisely because of their powers of incumbency and the manner in which they are abused over the electoral period.
Derek, there's been lots of talk on whether or not the military and, of course, the Veterans Association will be ready to accept the election no matter the outcome. Do you get the sense that they're ready to stand aside if the MDC is victorious here?
No, there's a lot of doubt that the military would in fact accept an opposition victory. They have far too much to lose. There are many people who feel that should the opposition look like they're going to win this elections, that the results will probably be shut down and ZANU-PF will engage in some sort of negotiation with the opposition rather than simply conceding defeat and handing over power.
Many thanks, Derek, for making time to speak to us. Derek Matisak there with the Institute for Security Studies in Harare. Now, to discuss Zimbabwe's prospects, I'm joined in Johannesburg by the president of the Zimbabwe-South African Forum, Anele, Ndlovu, and political analyst and entrepreneur, Ndlovu Modupe. In Lagos, we have a political analyst, Achike Chude, and in Kigali, we have a political commentator, Gonzaga Muganwa. So whoever wins the presidency is just a case of being handed a poison chalice. I want to start with the gentleman here. What do you think of this particular notion?
Well, with that, we've always wanted this new change. However, there's still, it's still very much in the hands of ZANU-PF, because as Derek said, that will they be fair? No, because there's been speculation all around that the army was actually transporting the material for elections, coupled the fact that when Robert Mugabe was ousted, it was actually said by Mnangagwa that Zimbabwe will be ruled by those who fought for it. So currently, we're not sure about that. Hey?
Anele, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Lots of headwinds here, not only for the economy, but even the political space, even the institutions are struggling a bit here. How credible is the ZEC to start with?
It's fairly understandable that people will have their doubts in any way. And just to speak about a lot of stuff is being said on social media space, and people tend to get carried away based on what is being spoken of in social media. In any country, by the way, with fake news and everything else, you'll get that. But I would emphasize on the point that let's stay on the ground. I think let's wait for something official. There are observers there from different nations around the world, and those are the people who are going to give us a clear picture of what's happening on the ground.
Right. I want to bring in Achike there into the conversation. We are hearing here unconfirmed reports that the military is actually the one that is moving around the materials for the poll as it is. Give me a sense of what you make of this, at least from the West African arm of things.
The military still has a lot of influence over what is happening over there in Zimbabwe. And I'm not exactly surprised, because the structures of the past that have become entrenched and embedded within the body politics of Zimbabwe are not structures that can be done away with overnight. After just about a few months of a change of political leadership at the very top, I mean, what was changed essentially was Robert Mugabe stepping aside, while Mnangagwa, who had been, very much been a critical component of this government, remains in power. So the very structures that Robert Mugabe had used all this while are the same structures that have been on ground. And so there has not been any, systemic change, of the body politics of Zimbabwe. And so it will not be surprising that the army, having played a very critical role, to sustain Robert Mugabe in power, would all of a sudden just disappear because Mugabe himself has left the scene. After all, they played a role in making sure that Robert Mugabe is no longer the president of Zimbabwe, and they still remain a very influential, very important aspect of Zimbabwe's politics. And that will give you, a sense of what they are going to do. They are not like people have said, they have too much, to lose. And the fact that the structures are still in place and that the people who had played key roles in making sure that the will of the Zimbabwean people had been subverted in the past are still there. So they will do what they have been known to do. Yes, I also agree that Mnangagwa has gone the extra mile to at least give the olive branch to the international community to witness this particular election, because there is a lot at stake. So they themselves have to be very, very careful. I'm talking about the present government in power, because the international community is watching. The observers are there, the foreign and local observers are there. And then I think the outcome of this election will determine the level of engagement they are going to have with whichever government comes in place. So if there is a clear-cut case of a blatant abuse of the electoral process, a clear-cut case of rigging, and denial of the people of their franchise at the election, then my fear would be that some of the things that Mnangagwa had been hoping for, praying for, in terms of maybe new opportunities for new investments to lift the Zimbabwean economy out of the doldrum, might be a pipe dream if things are not exactly handled right.
Right. Let's just move this conversation back to Rwanda. Gonzaga, last year we did see President Paul Kagame win with a landslide. Leading up to the election, there was a lot of convergence of political parties supporting the incumbent President Paul Kagame. On this case, we're seeing quite the opposite with the MDC. Tell me, what does this remind you of when it comes to the East African picture?
Yeah, the election in Zimbabwe is very interesting for our country, Rwanda, because like Rwanda, Zimbabwe has been led by a single revolutionary party for very many years, which has a close connection with the military, as the other commentators were saying. Similarly here, there is a total dominance of one ruling party, even though there are other smaller political parties which mainly exist to support the main one. So we are watching the election in Zimbabwe because it could tell how in the future a ruling party can reinvigorate, especially when its dominant leader is no longer in power. So what has happened since December in Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe was replaced by a member of his ZANU-PF, could indicate where in a region like ours, where we have several parties or several leaders who are in power for a long time. We see in Uganda, in Rwanda, in Burundi, in Congo. Could it be an indicator of a process how if it's not possible for an opposition party to win, can the ruling parties themselves manage to repress their wrong-serving leaders? Of course, the MDC in Zimbabwe makes it much more competitive, unlike here where it is the opposition that is officially recognized is extremely very weak to the extent that they couldn't put up a context. Of course, the difference is that the Rwanda at the moment is as an economy is doing much better than the situation has been in Zimbabwe over the last 2 decades or so.
Right, gentlemen, just allow me to put a pause on this particular one. We're going to be taking a short break. When we come back, our panelists will continue to dissect the issues and cross to our reporter Vu Mtila in Johannesburg's inner city, an epicenter of Zimbabwe's diaspora, all after the break. Welcome back to Capital Connection. Now joining us from the city streets is CNBC Africa's reporter, Vu Mtila.
Powerhouse buses in central Johannesburg. This is where many Zimbabweans use buses to travel to and from home. Of course, in December, it's where they get the most traffic. But we've heard over the last week and weekend that traffic has been simulated throughout here as many Zimbabweans go home to go place their vote for a new government. I've been speaking to a number of Zimbabweans on and off the record, and many of them want change. This is what they had to say.
I was saying any Zimbabwean right now wouldn't want ZANU-PF government to continue ruling that country. For only information, that country is one of the richest countries in Southern Africa. But because of the administration that's been prevailing, that's why millions and millions of Zimbabweans are here in South Africa. We are grateful South Africa accepted us. But it's time we have to sort out things back home and we prepare going back home. Honestly, I would want myself, if I were in Zimbabwe right now, I would say Chamisa is my favorite.
We don't even care. We don't care. We only want the change. Maybe the new government will look after us as Tina Amandevele. We this side of the Matebele. Any government who is going to take over, then he recognize us as Amandevele that we are the Zimbabwean people. Will be happy with that. But as far as they are still recognizing Amazon as the owners of Zimbabwe, it's like there's no point for us to vote. What is the reason of us to vote? Because they don't recognize us as the nation of the Mandevele. You understand what I mean? Now, if ever, the only way we can see that these people are also looking after us is for them to renovate the Matebele lane.
We are thinking that if Chamisa wins, maybe things will change in Zimbabwe. So I'm just saying to Zimbabweans, let's vote for Chamisa. So we will have a better future tomorrow.
And back to the panel discussion, gentlemen, picking up from the break before, we need to talk about the structure reform. There's a lot happening, debt to GDP over 75%. Tell me, where do you start? Let me just start with you, sir.
Basically, you're now speaking to the economical issues. Right. We have seen a lot of work being done in terms of the ease of doing business in Zimbabwe. Obviously, looking at other countries like New Zealand and obviously one of our upper neighbors here, we are learning legislative reforms and obviously the registration of companies and stuff like that. But talking about the economy itself, yes, we have got a bit of a lot in debt, which is a bit of a problem that has to be settled and rectified. We have got an issue of currency. We don't have our own currency currently, which is a big challenge which has to be rectified. Now, we are talking after the aftermaths. The most important thing that anyone should remember at this particular moment in time, I'll speak because Zimbabweans are still on queues going to vote, is to remember that this is about us, it's about Zimbabweans, it's not about the next president. So our choice of the leader should speak to our needs, to what we need, because this is about the Zimbabwean people. We need to change our own course. We need to steer the ship towards the right direction. And who can do that better for us? We just have to make those decisions wisely as we go to the ballot boxes.
Anele, let me just put a pause on that particular one. I want to bring you in because half of the voters right now are under the age of 35. I'm thinking that it makes one of you too. What would ZANU-PF have to sell to that 35-year-old voter to convince them that they are going to do something different from the old guard?
Okay, with that, the average voter under 35, what do we want? We want entrepreneurship, we want business, we want a thriving economy so that we can actually, sustain our livelihood. That's where Zimbabwe has to capitalize on the fourth revolution, digital age. What are we doing about the digital age? Because really, the way business is moving, it's no longer much of industrialization, the big business. Now people are making money on their apps. And currently, the app and the digital space in Zimbabwe is growing much. And people, ZANU-PF has to capitalize on that. And that's how they can attract the young base.
Achike, let's just go to Lagos. Achike, there's been lots of talk on whether or not if this government is legitimate. It is the opening up of an IMF program for Zimbabwe. Tell me, how possible is this, given the fact that some are arguing that the election will not be free and fair?
Yeah, well, I think we might not close the door on the nature and character of the election and how it's going to end up. Of course, there are pockets of complaints here and there from different people and all of that. But I think that the kind of climate that we saw, under the Mugabe era has not exactly been reached in terms of clear, cases of electoral malpractice and intimidation of people here and there. And the fact that the Zimbabwe government has opened up the electoral space for foreign observers to come in into the country is clearly an indication that he realizes that Zimbabwe has to go in a completely new direction. Under Robert Mugabe, that was definitely an impossibility. For the past 16 years, observers were not allowed into Zimbabwe. And so Mnangagwa has said, and he keeps on talking about the need for investment, the need to invite outsiders to also play in the economy itself, to bring in innovation, bring in businesses and all of that, and then grow the economy generally. He is very much aware that there is much needed inflow of foreign capital into Zimbabwe. And one way of doing that is to have an election that is credible, to give the international community that feeling that, it is not exactly business as usual. And that the man who had closed the door all this while is no longer on the scene, and that he's willing to move, in a particular direction. So from that perspective, I mean, if he wins the election, he's already started moving along that path. There's a clearer, chance for Chamisa himself if he gets into power, because people are going to look at a completely new era in Zimbabwe. For as long as, even in spite of Robert Mugabe's absence, there's always this feeling of, well, it's still the same of the same. After all, Mnangagwa had played a very key role throughout Mugabe's rule. And all of the atrocities that were committed by Robert Mugabe cannot exactly, some of them would have rubbed off on Mnangagwa. So what he's trying to do as much as possible is to distance himself, from the old regime of Robert Mugabe. But for Chamisa, I think it's much of a cleaner slate. He's a very young person. Of course, again, the issue of experience comes into play. But then when you ask yourself, you talk about experience in the African continent, is it exactly very invaluable, when you talk about governance? Because a lot of the people, a lot of the old hands that have handled, a lot of the countries in Africa have had a lot of experience, but experience in doing what? If you look at their countries and what we are seeing as output of their their intervention in those countries, you see the wide-ranging poverty in most parts of in most countries in Africa, the repression, you know, the conflicts that are also taking place, you know, in other parts of Africa and the rest. So experience in that sense might not exactly account, since we have seen that experience has not exactly translated into better governance in the continent. Right. So Chamisa comes in. I want to believe that, I mean, as a young person, he's more in touch with some of the innovations that we are now seeing, you know, all over the world and all of that, that he's going to bring all of these experiences to bear. And then also, as a result, attract much needed funds into Zimbabwe, and then bring in investments, and that is the only way they can begin to get out of the economic woes that they find themselves.
Let's just throw it over to Gonzaga there, because you're hitting some very pertinent points that I think we could borrow from the Rwandan experience. 1994, less than $100 was invested in the country, that is Rwanda. Of course, turbulent times at the time. Gonzaga, in your view, whether the economy is struggling where it is, FX pressures, liquidity issues in the country, that's Zimbabwe, what do you think the incoming president can actually learn from the Rwandan experience from 1994 to where the country is right now?
Yeah, of course, the most important lesson is that to engage all sectors of the society in paving the path going forward. I think the winner of the election in Zimbabwe should, for example, put in place policies that will attract the big Zimbabwean diaspora to return home and contribute actively to rebuilding the economy. Secondly, of course, there are some good policies that were supposed to have been implemented by the Mugabe era, but the practice were bad, particularly increasing the role of many Zimbabweans in the economy, rather than it being dominated by a small section of the population. Thirdly, of course, the working with the international community is extremely very important, since they provide essential credit, right. They provide expertise, they provide even areas for trade, which helps in rebuilding the economy. But the most important thing is that everybody is engaged. The winner should not look at running the government as the ruling party alone, but also the opposition. Whoever ends up in the opposition after the vote count should also be actively engaged, so that the political process is not very much antagonistic. One of the strategies that Rwanda took is that after the genocide, they built a system of political consensus, right, which encourages debate and agreeing on solutions rather than being antagonistic, being confrontational. So a form of consensus on major national issues would be very important in making sure that the young people of Zimbabwe are given full opportunities going forward.
That's very important stuff, Gonzaga. I want to bring it back to the studio. I want to borrow a quote here from Ronald Reagan when he was asked about his very old age. And he said, quote unquote, "I'll not make age an issue of this campaign. I'm not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." When should we worry about the inexperience of Mr. Chamisa?
It is indeed worrisome to a certain extent that he doesn't have any record. Besides, experience is quite essential, especially if you're going to be moving such kind of a monster Titanic like Zimbabwe, trying to get it out of the docking place and getting it into the sea so that you can steer towards the right direction. It's a big challenge there. Is he capable of that? I mean, those are the questions that are going through everybody's minds. Will he be able to steer this ship off the course that it's going currently and take it towards the right direction? It's worrisome. What then happens naturally is to say, let's put this thing on a scale, weigh it up and say, okay, here is Mnangagwa. Obviously, everybody has got certain differences and issues with his past, which he is trying very hard to distance himself from and steer the ship towards. We have seen that in the past, let's say 6 months, 7, 8 months to a year. Right. Chamisa, what has it done on the ground? What can we account for him and say, okay, fine, he has done 1, 2, 3. It seems like as if the scale then tilts quite heavily towards the other side.
And I see Motlobani just nodding very gently. What do you think of this? Should there be a perspective between the past and where he is right now? Of course, I'm assuming.
With that, no, because his past, it doesn't clear away. He was part of when there was a massacre in Zimbabwe. They used his intelligence services So basically, Robert Mugabe and Mnangagwa, they're two sides of the same coin. That's why we should rather move to Chamisa, who is much younger.
Right.
For example, there's a difference between a leader that is a revolutionary, a freedom fighter liberating the people, and one that is developing the country. You need two different policies, two different mindsets.
I'm afraid that's all the time that we did have for today's conversation on Capital Connection. Thank you to our guests in Lagos, Kigali, and Johannesburg. Join us again on Wednesday at 6:30 Central African Time, where Capital Connection will examine the economic impact of Africa as a result of the U.S. President Donald Trump's trade wars. I'm Arnold Segawa. Have a good night.